Human intelligence, frequently abbreviated humint, is intelligence gathered by means of interpersonal contact, as opposed to the more technical intelligence-gathering disciplines such as signals intelligence, SIGINT, imagery intelligence, IMINT, and measurement and signature intelligence, MOSINT. NATO defines humint as a category of intelligence derived from information collected and provided by human sources. Typical humint activities consist of interrogations and conversations with persons having access to information. The manner in which humint operations are conducted is dictated by both official protocol and the nature of the source of the information. Within the context of the U.S. military, most humint activity does not involve clandestine activities. Both counterintelligence and humint do include clandestine humint and clandestine humint operational techniques. Humint can provide several kinds of information. It can provide observations during travel or other events from travelers, refugees, escaped friendly POWs, etc. It can provide data on things about which the subject has specific knowledge, which can be another human subject, or, in the case of defectors and spies, sensitive information to which they had access. Finally, it can provide information on interpersonal relationships and networks of interest. Humint is both a source of positive intelligence, but also of information of strong counterintelligence value. Interviews should balance any known information requirements of both intelligence collection guidance and of counterintelligence requirements. Sources. Sources may be neutral, friendly, or hostile, and may or may not be witting of their involvement in the collection of information. Witting is a term of intelligence art that indicates that one is not only aware of a fact or piece of information, but also aware of its connection to intelligence activities. Examples of humint sources include, but are not limited to, the following: advisors or foreign internal defense, FID, personnel working with host nation, HN, forces or populations. Diplomatic reporting by accredited diplomats, e.g. military attaches. Espionage clandestine reporting, access agents, couriers, cutouts. Military attaches. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Prisoners of war, POWs, or detainees. Refugees. Routine patrolling, military police, patrols, etc. Special reconnaissance. Traveler debriefing, e.g., CIA Domestic Contact Service. Basic humint operations. Human source screening is the logical start of collection of humint. This involves selecting people who may be sources of meaningful humint, possibly positively identifying them, and conducting interviews of various types. Properly recording and cross-indexing the results of interviews is essential. No intelligence collection discipline is more likely to find meaning in apparently small bits of information than is humint. Especially when there is reason to have additional interviews with the same individual, the subsequent interviews need careful planning, especially when the interrogator does not speak the language of the person being interviewed. Intelligence preparation for working in cultures. As with other intelligence collection disciplines, intelligence analysis can play many supporting roles. An obvious one is biographical intelligence, to help identify known hostile undercover personnel, or individuals who will impartially mislead an assortment of national intelligence services for profit. Equally important is the broader area of cultural intelligence, which draws heavily on the social sciences. In a book review in the CIA Professional Journal, Lloyd F. Jordan recognizes two forms of study of culture, both of which are relevant to humint. In the review, Jordan describes Patai's book as an excellent example of a second type of cultural analysis. He reviews the first group of scientific analyses of culture and character as beginning with cultural anthropology as early as the 1920s. During World War II, those methods employed earlier in the academic community in this field of research were brought to bear upon a variety of problems connected with the war effort. It was precisely the inaccessibility of the target country and the availability of only fragmentary information about it that made national character research relevant to intelligence analysis during the war. The cultural anthropologists had long been developing models of former and disappearing cultures from fragmentary materials. The anthropologists, joined by the psychiatrists, combined the use of psychoanalytic theory, interaction theory, child development theory, and learning theory with standard anthropological research methods to construct models of the contemporary cultures of wartime enemy countries, Japan and Germany. The classic work of this type is Ruth Benedict's study of Japan, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. Mike observes that Benedict's approach was the only one in use until the late 1950s. National character studies focused on the statistically most significant personality characteristics of the group, i.e., the modal personality, rather than the most common manifestation of the traits. Modal personality construct tended to be related to the total culture, or at least, its salient features. The second class of studies, of which Patiz is an exemplar for Arab culture, had a more narrow focus. They concentrated on the relationship of personality traits to subsets of a given society or a given category of roles of that society, rather than on the identification of relationships between personality and the social structure as a whole. A third category, the comparative study, included Francis L. K. Sue's Americans and Chinese. Indeed, some recent and controversial works, such as Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, can be regarded as an extension of comparative study into the idea of conflicts among the groups compared. Basic differentiation by subject type. Different types of human subjects will share information voluntarily or involuntarily. The interrogator builds a relationship with the subject, a relationship that can be based on trust, fear, friendship, or any of a range of human emotions. Prisoners have an understandable fear of what may happen, and, contrary to tough guy images, it can be important to relax them and, as much as possible, put them at ease. Some organizations teach their members that the other side tortures everyone, and, if that is known, that fear must be addressed. Japanese prisoners in World War II often attempted suicide for that reason but were sometimes dissuaded, as by Guy Gabaldon. The question of torture should be disposed of at once. Quite apart from moral and legal considerations, physical torture or extreme mental torture is not an expedient device. Maltreating the subject is from a strictly practical point of view as short-sighted as whipping a horse to his knees before a 30-mile ride. It is true that almost anyone will eventually talk when subjected to enough physical pressures, but the information obtained in this way is likely to be of little intelligence value and the subject himself rendered unfit for further exploitation. Physical pressure will often yield a confession, true or false, but what an intelligence interrogation seeks is a continuing flow of information. Especially when the subject is a prisoner, the screener, who need not be the main interrogator, should examine the enemy prisoner of war, EPW, captive tag or other basic information giving the circumstances of capture, when, where, how, by whom, and so forth. If the subject is not under any restraint, it is still quite useful for a screener to prepare contact information comparable to the information on the EPW tag. When the subject is a POW, screeners should pay particular attention to rank insignia, condition of uniforms and equipment, and behavior demonstrated by the source. Screeners should look for things like attempts to talk to the guards, intentionally joining placement in the wrong segregation group, or any signs of nervousness, anxiety, or fear. Any source whose appearance or behavior indicates that he is willing to talk should be noted by the screeners. Assuming the subject has been under guard, the screener often can get valuable information about the subject's behavior from the guards. They can tell the screener how the source has responded to orders, what requests have been made by the source, what behavior has been demonstrated by the source, and so forth. Along with the basic contact information, such observations can be extremely helpful to the interrogator, who can study the information before the interview. Having background on the subject helps the interrogator retain the initiative in an interview. Again, for prisoners, screeners should examine the documents captured with the source and any documents pertaining to the source. If the subject is voluntary in providing documents, they may even be more valuable. Screeners may need to get help from linguists or document specialists in understanding the material. If the documents have insignia or other graphics, these should be compared with an existing graphics register, and added to it if they are new. Documents captured with the source, identification card, letters, map sections, and so forth, can provide information that identifies the source, his organization, his mission, and other personal background, family, knowledge, experience, and so forth. This information can be used to verify information from documents captured with the source and further assess his willingness to cooperate. When examining documents, screeners should look for items that will indicate whether the source is cooperative or willing to cooperate based on any specific personal interest. If the source has information pertaining to new foreign material, contact appropriate tech-int specialists, and if the source has information of target exploitation interest, contact the appropriate staff members who deal with targeting. These specialists are not necessarily qualified interrogators and may need to meet jointly with the subject and interrogator, or pass questions to the interrogator. Selecting potential sources. It involves evaluating an individual, or group of individuals, to determine their potential to answer collection requirements or to identify individuals who match a predetermined source profile. The goal of the process is to identify individuals who may have information of interest, and are willing or can be persuaded to cooperate. Willing individuals will undergo debriefing, and, subject to the relevant laws, regulations, and policies of the humint organization, unwilling people may be interrogated. Screening techniques also can select individuals who may be prospects to collect intelligence or work, in other ways, with the humint organization or its sponsor. Individuals may also be identified who are of interest to counterintelligence or to technical intelligence specialists. It may be necessary to screen individuals in a local area, as residents or possibly workers, to determine if they may be security risks. Identification. Since the identity of individuals is very relevant to humint, it makes extensive use of biometric data, e.g., fingerprints, iris scans, voice prints, facial/physical features, collected on persons of interest. Types of interviews. Subject interview has many of the same dynamics as a psychotherapeutic relationship. In an extended interrogation, if there is dialogue between interrogator and subject, there will be dynamics closely related to the psychotherapeutic concept of transference and countertransference. In the former, the subject projects emotional experiences of his own onto the interrogator, and in the latter, the interrogator will start thinking of the subject in terms of his own life experiences. There are other ways to use social science to understand interviews, in the broad sense of cooperative debriefing and hostile interrogation. Speaking of interrogation in the law enforcement context, there is a vast literature on interrogation, but hardly anything on it at all in the field of argumentation theory. Argumentation theorists have taken as their point of interest rational argumentation in which two parties reason together to try to get at the truth of a matter following collaborative rules of procedure. And the interrogation is scarcely a model of how to conduct balanced rational argumentation. Far from that, it seems to represent a coercive kind of dialogue exchange that is associated with intimidation. But a debriefing is not necessarily coercive. In some cases, an interrogation becomes less coercive, if the subject begins to identify with the conceptual framework of the interrogator. The latter can be a false Stockholm Syndrome context, or it can be a case where the subject actually sees that his belief system has fallacies, and he may start to share aspects of the interrogator's mindset. With World War II Japanese prisoners who believed that the shame of capture permanently separated them from that culture, and who were unable to commit suicide, appeared to see themselves as now part of the interrogator's culture, and became quite cooperative. There was one infallible method of convincing a reluctant Japanese prisoner to tell all he knows, to tell him, via interpreters, that they will send his name and picture back to Japan. We might note that few Japanese ever attempt to hold anything back. Being taken prisoner is not in their handbooks. No Japanese is ever taken alive. Thus, they are not drilled in the name rank serial know nothing more routine. They usually reveal everything easily without any persuasion and seem unhappy when their lack of information does not permit them to answer a specific question. Doesn't expect to return to Japan ever, has completely excluded his family and his wife from his thinking, and appears pleasantly resigned to going to the States and working there even as a prisoner for the rest of his life. In argumentative theory, interrogation is a form of information-seeking dialogue, but also can include other kinds of dialogue, such as negotiation. In both police and intelligence interviews, there may be bargaining, where the interrogator offers incentives for the subject to reveal information. The revealed information, especially in a humint context, is not necessarily about the interrogation and also may involve persuasion of the subject to speak. Before going on to study the relationship of the interrogation to information-seeking dialogue, some account must be given of other types of dialogue related to interrogation as well. For the interrogation has a way of shifting from pure information-seeking to other types of dialogue. As an example, argumentative theory recognizes persuasion, in the sense meant in the persuasion dialogue. With certain strategic interrogations, the interrogator might objectively question some of the practices of the subject's side. This is not done for direct elicitation of information, but to set a new context for further interrogation in which the subject might question some of his own loyalties and assumptions. In the case of the Japanese prisoners of the U.S., they began to operate in that new context. Debriefing. Debriefing involves getting cooperating human sources to satisfy intelligence requirements, consistent with the rules, laws, and policies of the humint organization. People being debriefed are usually willing to cooperate, although it is possible to obtain information through casual conversation. Debriefing may be conducted at all echelons and in all operational environments. Types of people being interviewed include both tasked and non-tasked individuals. Tasked individuals are, in some way, part of the interviewer's organization. Tasked personnel giving brief reports of the enemy use the salute technique. More formal or extensive debriefing methods are used for obtaining specialized or complex information. Other than talking to tasked personnel, there is a tendency for some humint collectors to regard debriefing as a waste of time. The approach to a voluntary source needs to be quite different from that to a cooperative prisoner, especially if the interrogator has reason to believe the source is knowledgeable. While a subject may be a volunteer, a refugee, or displaced person is likely to have some of the fears and uncertainty undergone by POWs. Active listening and sympathy can pay great benefits, especially in the areas of love of family, and anger at those who made them homeless. The humint collector should allow specialized or senior sources more latitude to interpose their opinions and evaluations. Prior to the meeting, collectors need to examine all available information, to have an idea of the subject's personality and motivations when beginning to talk to them. It also may require unobtrusive observation of the subject to establish such things as patterns of activity and likes and dislikes. The closer the interview environment can be to the customary surroundings of the subject, the more comfortable and cooperative the source may be. One example of source that should have latitude are trained foreign internal defense, FID, or unconventional warfare, UW, personnel that work with local residents, or military forces, on a routine basis. Such people may very well themselves have humint and/or CI training. U.S. Special Forces groups have two-man humint/CI teams that can augment operational detachments. Historically, after the World War II experience of resistance leaders such as the Jedburgh teams, occurred to various commanders that soldiers trained to operate as guerrillas would have a strong sense of how to fight guerrillas. Even before specialist FID/UW units were constituted, organizations such as military assistance advisory groups, as in Greece just after World War II, also had extensive local knowledge. Before the partition of French Indochina in 1954, French Groupement de Commandos Mixtes Aéroports, GCMA, took on this role, drawing on French experience with the Jedburgh teams. GCMA, operating in Tonkin and Laos under French intelligence, was complemented by Commandos Nord Vietnam in the north. In these missions, the SOF teams lived and fought with the locals. United States Army Special Forces, U.S. Marine Corps Combined Action Program, CAP, program personnel, originally in Vietnam, but now in Iraq, and various training detachments are apt to have valuable and structured information. In all cases, the more knowledgeable the interrogator is to the volunteer, the better the result is likely to be. A collector does not need to keep the same level as control as in a hostile interrogation. Sometimes, admitting ignorance of a custom, and respectfully asking for explanation, will trigger a flow of information. While it takes sophistication, the best general approach to willing subjects is a planned elicitation of information, always with a specific goal in mind. The key to elicitation is the establishment of a rapport between the elicitor and the source, normally based on shared interests. In the initial stages of an elicitation, the collector confines his conversations to innocuous subjects such as sports and social commentary. Dependent on the value of the source, the collection environment, and the security consciousness of the subject, the humint specialist will then shift to a more focused topic. Once in that mode, elicit the information by continuing to ask for clarification, with questions of the form "I agree, however, what did you mean by," or expressing a hypothetical situation. The focused discussion can involve mild flattery and interest in the conversation, or, in a much more delicate approach, selectively challenging statements or introducing new information to show knowledge and stimulate more responses. Interrogation. As opposed to debriefing, the subject of interrogation is not necessarily cooperating with the obtaining of information by the organization. The subject is normally in custody, although the legal circumstances may be such that an uncooperative subject may be able to leave. Examples of subjects being interrogated include POWs, individuals detained by patrol as not being from the area, and a thief arrested by the civilian police. Interrogation is a skilled technique, which often involves building rapport with the subject. In an intelligence context, interrogators should be trained specialists, although they may work with linguists and subject matter experts. Regardless of whether the interview is voluntary or involuntary, the interrogator needs to keep the initiative. To keep the initiative, the interrogator may not need to be harsh. Indeed, the many successful interrogators are formally polite within the subject's cultural traditions. If, in societies with a strong host-guest tradition, the interrogator takes the role of host, that can allow polite domination of the conversation. The interrogation process itself is a humint collection, not analysis, technique. It may well be that the interrogator, after the interview, does analysis, cross-checking statements made against name indices and wiring diagrams of social networks. The interrogator checks his notes against the finished report to ensure that the report contains and identifies the information as heard, seen, or assumed by the source. Planning the initial interview. While the actual interview technique will vary with the attitude of the subject and the needs of the interviewer's service, the interrogator should develop a basic plan for the first interview. This might be put into a paper folder along with documents, or copies, associated with the subject, or, if available, it can go into a humint database so other interrogators, analysts, cultural and language specialists, can review it. Reviews can help plan the current interview, or give ideas to other interrogators for other interviews. The basic elements to collect are: any urgent humint collection requirements, serial number of EPW/detainee to be questioned, location and time for the questioning, primary and alternate approaches, questioning plan including topics to be covered and the planned sequence of these topics, prepared questions for unfamiliar or highly technical topics, method of recording and reporting information obtained, linguist support, if needed. Additional general or technical interrogators needed. The preliminary interview is not intended to obtain intelligence, but only to enable the interrogators to make a firm assessment of the character and type of subject with whom they will have to deal. How much psychological pressure to use, how many symbols of dominance are appropriate to use, require great judgment. Some classic interviewing techniques, without threatening the subject, make him uncomfortable, as, for example, having interrogators, preferably two of them, seated behind a table at the far end of a long room, so that the subject after entering will have some distance to walk before taking his chair in front of them. This device will enable them to observe his poise and manner, and may often quite unsettle the subject. In this pressure-oriented technique, the interrogators should sit with their backs to the main source of light in order to obscure their faces, veil their expressions, and place a strain on the prisoner. The subject can be placed under further strain by providing him an uncomfortable chair, say one with a polished seat and shortened front legs so that he tends to slide off it, or one with wobbly legs. On the other hand, an opposite technique has sometimes been successful. The prisoner is made so comfortable, after a hearty lunch with beer, that he drops his guard in drowsiness. When conducting military source operations, the location of the questioning will have psychological effects on the source. The questioning location should be chosen and set up to correspond to the effect that the humint collector wants to project in his planned approach techniques. For example, meeting in a social type situation such as a restaurant may place the source at ease. Meeting in an apartment projects informality while meeting in an office projects more formality. Meeting at the source's home normally places him at a psychological advantage, while meeting in the humint collector's work area gives the collector a psychological edge. The humint collector should consider the status and level of the source, security, the workspace available, furnishings, the amount of lighting provided, and the ability to heat or cool the room as needed. Characteristics of the interrogator. Interrogation is an interaction, and, even before considering the different attitudes the subject may have, the interrogator needs to know his own style, strengths, and weaknesses. He needs to judge if he needs cultural advice, how to handle language issues, and if he needs specialist help. The humint collector must also consider the physical conditions of the source and himself. After extended operations, there may be a limit on how long either the humint collector or source can concentrate on a given subject. Support needs. If the interrogator thinks that offering incentives will help, he must decide what they are and how they are obtained. If incentives were promised in earlier interviews, the collector must know if they were delivered. If they were not, the interrogator needs to plan how the failure to deliver may interfere with any trust built, and how to correct the problem. The humint collector must decide if he will need additional support including analytical, technical, or interpreter support. On rare occasions, it may be desirable for the humint collector to seek polygraph support or support from a behavioral science consultant, BSc. BScs are authorized to make psychological assessments of the character, personality, social interactions, and other behavioral characteristics of interrogation subjects and advise humint collectors of their assessments, as needed. Attitudes of the subject. The basic attitude of the subject will help define the approach to the interview. There are 4 primary factors that must be considered when selecting tentative approaches. The source's mental and physical state. Is the source injured, angry, crying, arrogant, cocky, or frightened? The source's background. What is the source's age and level of military or civilian experience? Consider cultural, ethnic, and religious factors. The objective of the humint collection. How valuable is the source's potential information? Is it beneficial to spend more effort convincing this source to talk? The humint collector himself. What abilities does he have that can be brought into play? What weaknesses does he have that may interfere with the humint collection? Are there social or ethnic barriers to communication? Can his personality adapt to the personality of the source? Cooperative and friendly. A cooperative and friendly source offers little resistance to the interrogation and normally speaks freely on almost any topic introduced, other than that which will tend to incriminate or degrade him personally. To obtain the maximum amount of information from cooperative and friendly sources, the interrogator takes care to establish and to preserve a friendly and cooperative atmosphere by not inquiring into those private affairs which are beyond the scope of the interrogation. At the same time, he must avoid becoming overly friendly and losing control of the interrogation. The interrogator, however, may need to get expert advice on the customs of the subject's culture. While Americans might not spend time inquiring about the journey to the place of the interrogation, the health of one another's family, etc., not to do so is extremely impolite in some cultures. Not following cultural norms may transform a cooperative subject into a silent one. For example, Arab cultural norms, reasonable to follow in a friendly conversation with a subject of that culture, do, often in ceremonial terms, speak of family. Handshakes are traditional at the start and end of the meeting. Neutral and nonpartisan. A neutral and nonpartisan source is cooperative to a limited degree. He normally takes the position of answering questions asked directly, but seldom volunteers information. In some cases, he may be afraid to answer for fear of reprisals by the enemy. This often is the case in low-intensity conflict, LIC, where the people may be fearful of insurgent reprisals. With the neutral and nonpartisan source, the interrogator may have to ask many specific questions to obtain the information required. Hostile and antagonistic. A hostile and antagonistic source is most difficult to interrogate. In many cases, he refuses to talk at all and offers a real challenge to the interrogator. An interrogator must have self-control, patience, and tact when dealing with him. Inexperienced interrogators may do well to limit their interview, and pass the subject to a more senior interrogator. When handing off the subject, the next interrogator will find it very useful to have any clues why the subject is being hostile. The recalcitrant subject of an intelligence interrogation must be broken, but broken for use like a riding horse, not smashed in the search for a single golden egg. No two interrogations are the same. Each interrogation is thus carefully tailored to the measure of the individual subject. The standard lines of procedure, however, may be divided into 4 parts. Arrest and detention. Preli.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.